Welcome to TEDxYouth at LCJSMS 2017, Going Beyond.
If you're like me and have an older brother or sister who claims they're always right, you know what it's like to be in a sibling argument. My sister and I used to argue almost every single day. Don't get me wrong, we still do. But thankfully, not as much. Our arguments varied from whether the green fairy doll was mine or hers. It was mine, by the way, to how to spell our new neighbor's name. She would always win the arguments that had to do with memorizing numbers and letters, and I could never figure out how she always won. Until I learned about synesthesia. Most of you are probably wondering what that is. Synesthesia is when a person's senses are connected, when one of the 5 senses triggers an unrelated sense. If you still don't get it, that's okay. It took me a lot of research to fully understand what it means. It's basically when a person thinks of a number or letter, it appears in a color. If you haven't heard of it before, it's because it's rare. Anywhere in 1 to 50,000 to 100,000 people. Fortunately, one of these synesthetic people happens to live in the room right next to mine, my sister. She's the one who first introduced me to this topic. Now, you are probably wondering, where am I going with this? Well, what could happen if you could teach synesthesia? The reason I'm here on stage is to talk about the wonderful power of synesthesia and how we could apply it to learning new things in school. You should all have envelopes that was just recently given to you. What I want you to do is for the first few paragraphs, every time I say the word TEDx, smell your card. This way, you'll have a first-hand experience on what it's like to have synesthesia. There are many types of synesthesia. Reading and counting colors when numbers and letters appear in colors in your mind. Tasting words when you hear a word, a specific flavor appears in your mouth. Hearing colors when you see a color, a specific sound you hear. The reason to why this happens is unknown. It's a rare condition, so there's going to be a limited amount of research. So let's start with the basics. You don't need to be like me. Join TEDx, smell your card. Spend 8 months researching this topic to realize that this phenomenon happens in the brain. So I want you to think back to that high school science classroom with your old science teacher explaining to you what neurons are while you're too busy talking to the person next to you about Sarah's new haircut. And it was a terrible haircut. I don't know what she was thinking. Neurons are cells in the nervous system that transmit information to other nerve, muscle, or gland cells. After birth, the brain of a newborn is consumed with all this information from the baby's senses and organs. With all that information, there needs to be a way it can make it back to the brain to be processed. To do so, nerve cells must make connections with one another, transmitting the impulses back to the brain. Back to my TEDx topic, Baron Cohen believes that the reason for synesthesia is because there are more connections between neurons, causing the usual modularity to break down. On the other hand, Daphne Marr, a psychologist at McMaster University, believes that we're all born with connections that create synesthesia, but most of us just lose the connections as we grow. As I said before, my sister Olivia has synesthesia. When she pictures a number or a letter in her head, it appears in a color. And as much as it kills me inside to admit, I am jealous of her in that aspect. I mean, she has told me what it's like to have it, and I think it's a great advantage. Memorizing something for a class would be so easy. As spectacular as this condition is, she has told me that a disadvantage for her would be when 2 letters have similar colors, she often mixes them up. When researching this topic, I was extremely lucky because Grace Hendra, another TEDx, smell your card, member, happens to also have synesthesia. Grace's synesthesia is intense, and so is my jealousy. Hers is even more advanced. Numbers and letters have a color and gender. She can also taste words. For example, the word potato has a sour lemon flavor in her mouth, or plain words taste like cardboard. Having this quality helps her at school, but at the same time, it's distracting. I was talking to her about it, and she told me that during a math test, she was looking at an equation and a scene appeared in her head. Looking at all those numbers made her mind envision a family in Mexico having a family reunion, which I think is really fascinating. Distracting for a math test, but really fascinating. You have all done very well smelling your card every time I say the word TEDx. And that is what it feels like to have synesthesia, to constantly be smelling that scent every time you hear the word. One of the first reports of synesthesia came from George Sanch in 1812. In his dissertation, he describes what it's like to have it and his experiences with it. Charles Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, describes synesthesia in his work Color Associations. Ever since then, there have been more and more publications on the matter, but it wasn't until the end of the 19th century until U.S. scientist Mary Calkins introduced the term synesthesia. In the late 1980s, neurologist Richard E. Seitwick believed that the cause was in the limbic system, where the higher order thinking occurs. Due to the lack of resources and technology, back then people who had synesthesia were classified as ill, or people with great fantasy, acid junkies, or even potheads. Synesthesia is so interesting and complex that the more we know, the less we understand. Thanks to research, we have been able to find out that it is more commonly found in females, and people who have it tend to be more artistic and creative. My whole talk is about teaching synesthesia, so I wanted to do the experiment myself in order to see if it were possible to learn. First, I had to do some research. Once I searched it up, I was met with articles telling me it was impossible, others saying that it was possible, and some said only certain types of synesthesia were teachable. In the end, I decided to test it out myself. I was going to teach people how to connect their sense of smell with words. So I selected 5 words: lock, fire, fluffy, penguin, and hammer. Then I went to CVS and bought 5 different air fresheners. I wrote each word on a card, then sprayed each card with a scent, and so each word had its own scent. During the spring musical, there was a lot of free time, so I asked 10 people from 6th to 8th grade if they're willing to do an experiment. Thankfully, they all said yes. Each person had 30 seconds to pick up a card, smell it, and try to memorize it. Penguin, which smelled like white flowers, melon, and vanilla, and fire, which smelled like driftwood and sea spray, were my most popular words. After completing this experiment, I realized I wanted to do more. I then remembered one of the articles saying only certain types of synesthesia were teachable. So I made another experiment. This time, I wanted to connect people how to connect sounds with words. So I downloaded a sound app that had over 100 different sound buttons. Then I chose another 5 words and wrote them on note cards. Instead of 10 people, I used 8 people instead to make this experiment. Each person had 30 seconds to pick up a card, and every time they picked up a card, I would press a button which made a sound. Unicorn was my most popular word. But when I did the second experiment, it felt very different. It took longer for people to write down their answers. In conclusion, I do believe that it is possible to teach synesthesia, but to an extent. It is possible to teach because I did it, but it won't stay after just one lesson. Teaching using synesthetic methods needs to be reinforced constantly, and what better way to do that than in school? We are in school for 14 years, starting from kindergarten to high school. And if you include college, that's 18 years of education. That's almost 2 decades worth of learning new information. It's important to start this in kindergarten, because that's when we start learning skills such as reading and writing. When I was in kindergarten, I had just moved from the Netherlands to Spain. I already knew Dutch and English due to both of my parents being American. So picture this, a younger me on her first day of school, wearing a new uniform, a new country, and wearing my favorite pink headband. Part of living in a new country means learning a new language, and Spanish is completely different compared to Dutch or English, so I struggled communicating with my fellow students. If only during my kindergarten years I was able to learn Spanish quicker by using synesthetic methods, I wouldn't have needed my teachers to translate what I was saying in order to ask my classmates if they wanted to be friends. Don't worry, because this story does have a happy ending. I was able to learn Spanish, and now I'm bilingual in both English and Spanish. Unfortunately, I did lose my Dutch and can now only say a few words. I don't want any kids to feel the way I did. I felt left behind, alone, and less smart than the other kids. People who struggle to keep up with their grade won't face that any problem anymore. And if we continue this cycle, humans could evolve into a race where everyone has synesthesia. And ask around. You never know. You might be like me and have a family member who has synesthesia. After tonight, half of you will forget all about my speech. But before you leave, I want you to smell your card one more time. And think of the word TEDx as you do. Thank you.